I'm Sari.
And I'm Haley.
And this is Seamwork Radio. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Seamwork Radio. So today we are talking about escaping the cult of efficiency, which is kind of a term that I came up with in thinking about this subject. So we're going to talk about what that is today and how it came to dominate our culture and how the demise of handcraft really played a role in that shift. We're also going to talk about why creative hobbies can feel a bit like work sometimes and why I think that's okay. We'll talk about that. And then how to recognize when you're obsessing over efficiency yourself, and then 5 tips to release yourself from that cult of efficiency. So, we're going to be talking a lot about culture today and our mindsets around being productive and being efficient. So, I think it's going to be a really, really interesting conversation. I'm curious, Haley, our icebreaker for today. I'm curious if there's been a time that you can think of when the amount of sewing that you were doing really stressed you out, or the amount that you were not doing really stressed you out.
Yes, I have an answer for both. Okay, so when I think that the time that sewing or the amount of sewing I was doing stressed me out the most was probably when I was like in my last year of college studying fashion design. As your like thesis, when for most fashion programs, you have to create an entire like couture quality collection that will be like in a runway show. Mine was on like, this big fancy runway show. And of course, like being the overachiever that I am, I was like, I'm going to learn how to make shoes and I'm going to make my own shoes for every look. And I'm also going to learn jewelry making and I'm going to make all like, I wanted it like, lifestyle brand head to toe, which was great. And already like kind of an insane amount of work. On top of the fact that I worked in college and had like, a social life and a boyfriend and all of that. But on top of that, I decided, what will be really cool is I also had an internship also. And then on top of that, I was like, at the time I was making wedding dresses, I thought that that was what I wanted to do was make custom wedding, not just dresses, wedding outfits. And I took on 2 custom wedding dress clients that year. And literally, like if I was every waking moment, if I was not like in class or like eating, I was sewing. Even when I was eating, I was still sewing. And even when I was in class, I was like making order of operations about sewing and making notes of, everything. And it was too much. It's too much to sew like, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. And after that, I was just burned out. I didn't really want to sew. And it turned me off from doing custom work for reasons beyond sewing too much. That's a whole other discussion. The time that I sewed not very much that stressed me out was when I was pregnant. I sewed very little and I felt incredibly guilty about it, and it made me feel like a total fraud because I'm like a sewing pattern designer who like has had zero interest in sewing. I think I sewed like maybe like 3 things the entire time I was pregnant, which is like, and most of them were like kind of like work mandated projects like I committed to making on the clock. So I felt really guilty about that. What about you? Tell me about your sewing stress story.
I think I'm kind of in that latter boat that you just mentioned because I haven't been sewing lately at all. I haven't sewn anything. If you look at my projects on the community, my last one was quite a long time ago that I actually finished. I have started things since then and not finished them. And the reason is just life circumstances. I've been, as we've mentioned in a few episodes, I've been moving and I've mentioned this before, but my old house was really, really small. And so I didn't have a sewing space there and I would have to go to the office to sew, which was fine by me because it was close by. So in the last few months, we've actually been renovating our office, and it's been like total chaos there. And then at the same time, I've been moving. So I haven't had time to do much of anything. And now we live quite far from the office. So I just bought a new sewing machine for myself. I bought myself a Bernina. It's sitting over here next to me, still in the box. Oh, actually,
Yay.
it's propping up my camera right now in the box. So I haven't unpacked it yet because I'm still unpacking, but I am very excited to get back into sewing. So it hasn't been a lack of interest. It's just been more
Mhm.
circumstance. But like you, it has stressed me out because I kind of feel like a fraud. Like I haven't been doing all the creative things that are a huge part of my life. So yeah, it's kind of stressing me out. And now that I've moved, I have a lot of home deck sort of projects in mind that I want to do. And we're adopting some cats, I think, this weekend. So I really want to
What?
make like the cat bed and like lots of stuff for them, toys and things like that, and spoil them. So yeah, we're getting a couple of kittens this weekend. I think we're doing a meet and greet on Saturday. So I'm really excited about it.
I know what that means.
Yeah.
Oh, this is news to me. I'm so excited right now.
Yeah, I haven't really told anyone except for my mom. So I'm really excited.
Oh, I feel special.
Our beloved cats passed away last year. Both of them were senior boys and they passed away last year. So it's been almost a year without pets, which is like I can't believe I've lasted a year without pets. It's been hard for me.
Mhm.
But anyway, yeah, so
Yeah, I was surprised too.
yeah. I'm just really excited about home deck sewing, making some, just basic stuff like tea towels and, just pillows, things around the house and nesting a little bit. So I'm going to get back into it soon, but it has been stressing me out a little bit.
Yeah, well, and as we're like, this episode will be airing in September. So I guess if you're listening to this, it's like, fall, air quotes,
Mm.
fall. And that's just to me like such like it's like a time that's perfect for like settling into your sewing plans and like, amping up your productivity if that's something you want to do.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today.
Hmm.
So I wanted to start by talking about this memory I have when we were launching. We have a feature on our community, on the Seamwork community, where you can set sewing goals. So you can define a sewing goal for yourself and kind of create a little checklist of steps that you want to go through. And you'll even get reminders about your goal so you can keep on top of it and post updates and connect it to projects that you're making. So we were creating this feature and we asked for some feedback just to kind of this was when we were first designing it, so we didn't even have the feature out yet. And I'll never forget this bit of feedback we got from one of our CMRC members who was saying, this really doesn't resonate with me because I spend all of my time at work thinking about goals and productivity and checklists and to-do lists. And I don't want to think about that when I'm
Hmm.
sewing. And that just made me think because I love goals and checklists and to-do lists. I love that stuff. And but I thought, yeah, I can really see that perspective because sometimes
Hmm.
sewing really can feel like work instead of play. And I actually think that's okay sometimes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But first I wanted to talk about this idea of efficiency in your sewing and productivity in your sewing and how you can create more of a balance around that so that it doesn't feel stressful to you. So, talking about this idea of efficiency. So, I recently read this book that I was telling you, Haley, about called Do Nothing. And it's by an author named Celeste Headley. And she puts forth this idea of efficiency as being this value that's kind of it's come from a few places. It's come from our culture, it's come from religion, it's come from, especially in the last century or so, from corporate values. And that kind of infected every other aspect of our lives so that we're always thinking about
Hmm.
productivity, we're always thinking about efficiency. And in our culture here in the US, and I think this is true in many other places in the world, these days as well, partly because of the influence of US culture, efficiency is just really highly valued. It's really, really highly valued. Hard work and efficiency are seen as, benchmarks of really a good character in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
And I was thinking about this idea because I think efficiency is something that we're naturally drawn to. I think as humans, we want to be efficient. I think as animals, we want to be efficient. Nature is efficient. Nature is always looking for ways to be more efficient. And so I think that's something that just naturally every person has within them. But I think culturally, we've really become obsessed with it. We've really taken it to an extreme and are thinking about efficiency all the time. And she points out in this book that a big part of this is in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, this process really, or this value really came to the forefront. At that time, before that, for centuries, we'd had craftspeople who were
Hmm.
creating things on their own, and then they were paid by the piece, or they were paid by the actual work that they created. You would craft a bowl and you would sell the bowl. And that really became replaced during the Industrial Revolution with factory work. And with factory work, time is money. It's not about a single person with their own tools selling a single piece. It's about using people almost as, as cogs in the machine, as pieces of labor that's just an input into this larger system. So she has this quote in here that I wanted to read about this time period. She says, "Time began to equal money. Employees worked with machines that put out a relatively stable number of products per hour. So the longer the machine was running, the more product a factory would produce and the more money the owner would make. More hours meant more money. Employees were usually paid not by the task, as they had been for centuries before, but by the hour." So this really changed the way people thought about efficiency and time and money. And there was also this concept of scientific management that came out of this. And scientific management is something that's still really influential today. And that's kind of the idea of running everything by the numbers, strictly by the numbers.
Hmm.
And obviously that also has had a huge effect on our culture today. And I think the way that work is just hugely influential on our lives and the way we think. And I found that really, really interesting. And then she also points out that at the same time, there was this myth that really came to prominence during this era of the self-made man, and that's been very, very powerful myth in the US, especially. It's really integrated into what people think of as the American dream. So the idea is that if you just work hard enough, you can have it all. If you don't have it all, that means you're not working hard enough. And there's this glorification of busyness and constant work. And this is something that's still really, really prevalent in our culture in various ways. And, obviously it has a lot of implications, especially for people, who don't have it all. There's a lot of very deeply ingrained ideas in our culture that go behind that beyond, just the Industrial Revolution. But I think that's a really interesting point, and I think it's still very prevalent in terms of like hustle culture, startup culture, the veneration of tech billionaires. It's just part
Hmm.
of the kind of the water we swim in these days. So this idea of work and busyness and efficiency and productivity being all important has really seeped into other aspects of our lives. And I don't know about you, Haley. I think about being more productive and being more efficient. This is something I've really, really struggled with. I think about it all the time,
Hmm.
even in my free time. Last night, I mentioned that I moved to the country. So we have a bigger property now and a bigger garden, and there's a lot to do. There's a lot to take care of. And last night after dinner, I was like, okay, well, I got to go run the irrigation. I got to put that on a timer. And then I'm going to go and do some weeding. And then I'm going to go and I need to go to the shop and like transplant this plant that I bought and like all this stuff. And, it's fun stuff. It's stuff I enjoy doing. But I realized that I didn't take a break. I didn't, I wasn't resting. So
Hmm.
I think it's really interesting to think about hobbies in that light because sewing and other creative hobbies can also feel like work, don't you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think for me with my sewing, especially because that, there's a very fine line between my work and my hobby. Actually, there's like the line is like fairly non existent at times because I sew as part of my living. So, really, for me, it can be really hard to switch from that like work creative mindset
Mhm.
to that like, slow down personal creative mindset.
Yeah. And I think that is one of the things that this book doesn't really address, and I think was one of the shortcomings of this particular book, is that I think as humans, and this often I think gets left out of conversations about slowing down and about overwork and things like that, which is that we like to work. A lot of people like to work, myself included. I think not everybody has the privilege of having a job that they enjoy. So that is definitely true. But for some people, work is, a really great outlet. It's creative, it's a way to build things, which I think humans are naturally inclined to do. It gives us opportunities to work together, which I think is another thing that humans really find value in. It gives us these concrete accomplishments and the sense of progress. It gives us access to a flow state. It's, beneficial in a lot of ways if you have a job that is fulfilling, or if you have some form of work that is fulfilling, even if it's not your job. And so I think that often gets left out, is that people actually become workaholics because work can be really addictive. It can be really fulfilling in a lot of ways. And so the problem is that our culture has really exploited this and taken it to an extreme where, these aspects of work that you enjoy and that are a bit addictive for some of us, our culture really venerates them to the point that you're told to, really overindulge in that. And it's just like overindulging in anything else. That's what I've noticed. And I think the path is not necessarily to have this clear, for me personally, not to have this clear delineation, which when I'm home, I'm resting, and when I'm at work, I'm working, and there's nothing in between, but to have some states that are sort of in between where you're getting joy out of work, but not taking it so seriously and not being so obsessed with things like efficiency. And I think that's where creative hobbies, including sewing or knitting or gardening or woodworking or whatever it is that you like to do to create things in your spare time, I think that's the role that they can play, is in this liminal space between work and play. So that's my little spiel about what I think about work and leisure. What do you think, Haley?
Approaching not just my hobby, but also my work state and my relationships and all of these things with more intention. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? And not like getting just like, I don't know. I feel like it can be there's so many temptations now of like distractions in the world, the internet and social media and all of that. Being intentional with the way that I spend my time, whether that is purposefully resting and laying my butt on the couch and reading a book or, you know, working, sewing, whatever it may be, is setting the intention of what I'm doing and then doing it, not just like mindlessly doing things. I feel like when I can tap into that place and that energy in all aspects of my life, not just in my free time, then I'm like living my most fulfilled life that's not obsessed,
Hmm.
with this like, cult of efficiency, which I love that phrase because it's like so dramatic, like dun dun dun.
It is dramatic, but I think that's true. Like, I think it's really hard
It
to
is.
escape. I think you hear, people are always complaining about how busy they are, and it makes you feel like you should be busy too. And if you're not busy, then why aren't you busy? You must not be very important, or you must not be doing good things. So I think it's really infiltrated so much of our lives and the way we think about things that it's hard to even first you have to recognize it, and then you have to,
Mhm.
consciously make decisions. There's actually I had this other quote that I pulled from this book, Do Nothing, which is she wrote, "What I learned is that if you don't consciously choose a slower path, you will likely default to the pedal to the metal speeds of modern life." And I
Mhm.
think the keywords from me there are consciously choose, because that's the part that's really difficult. I think it's really hard to resist the temptation to do more, to work harder, and to always focus on more, 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 acquiring more, creating more,
Mhm.
doing more things. For me, it's really, really hard. I'm definitely oriented that way. When we did the Strengths Finder test a while back, like I think achiever was my number two. My number one was
Mhm.
learner. My second one was achiever, and I am definitely that type of person. So having to consciously choose to not always be productive and not always be efficient has been really it's been a journey for me. It continues to be a journey.
Yeah, I think that's something that you and I both have in common is that it's a mindset that we constantly have to cultivate
Mhm.
because I think that our default can be that pedal to the metal,
Yeah, definitely.
which is why when we get like reviews for the podcast and people are like, you guys are so chill, I'm like, okay. I'm glad you guys think so. I work really hard at it.
Yeah. I think there's just a certain type of person. We're both the type to be, I don't want to say high strung, but high achievers, like very like, yeah, a little bit, but project outward calm. Like we don't like other people to see us sweat, I think.
Oh, yeah. No. Yeah. Which is like also like maybe slightly toxic. Like
Yeah.
you, you will not see me struggle.
Yeah. It's a strength and a weakness, but
Yeah,
anyway,
totally. Like everything.
yeah, like everything is a strength and a weakness. I do think that for me, thinking about this in terms of sewing and in terms of my hobbies, like I don't do you think a lot about productivity when it comes to your sewing practice or even other creative hobbies that you have?
I was thinking about this when we outlined this episode. And, I'm a hobby person. I have hobbies. I sew, I roller skate, I garden, I cook, and I bake. Those are kind of my key ones. And the only one that I obsess over my productivity is sewing. And at first I was like, well, it's because that's like my profession. But you know what? I really don't think that that's it. I think that it's the thing that people know about me. And I'm like, people know me for. So I feel like there's this aspect. I'm like, like almost ashamed to admit, we're all friends here. Is that it's kind of like it's like very tied into my pride and like keeping up appearances of like,
Mhm.
yeah, I am like a sewer, and this is like this huge part of my identity where like the rest of my hobbies are like I don't like really post about them on social media or necessarily even talk about them super often unless I happen to be around someone else who shares that hobby with me. So I don't obsess about them. I just do them when I feel like it to the degree in which I feel inspired to, and then that's it. If I put it down for a period of time, like, I don't sweat it.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I feel a little for me personally, a little differently. I would say that I don't really worry about how much I sew generally. I mean, a little bit. I mentioned earlier I'm a little bit stressed out about it just because it's been like months now. But area where I feel a little stressed by a lack of productivity is I also have a lot of hobbies and a lot of different hobbies, creative hobbies. Some of the ones you mentioned, except for roller skating, but I do have like other fitnessy hobbies. But where I get stuck is I always want to do more. And I feel like, for example, I love to draw and, not for any particular purpose, but just because I find it really relaxing and it, I find it very calming and kind of like a mindfulness activity. And I just feel like I don't have time to do it as much as I want to do it. And so that kind of stresses me out sometimes because I'm like, well, I want to be able to garden and I want to be able to draw and paint and I want to be able to write and I want to be able to do all of these things, but how can I do them all? It just reminds me of I think it was Derek Sivers or somebody. There's like a quote that you can do anything you want, but you can't do everything you want. And
Mm-hmm.
I think about that and I think, well, that means I have to make a choice. And that stresses me out because I do want to be able to do it
Yeah.
all. I can't accept that. So that's where I start to get a little bit stressed out. So that I think is something that for me it's something that I struggle with and that I think can make things a little bit less enjoyable if you start to feel like it's all on a checklist, don't you think? Instead of
Mm-hmm.
something you're choosing to do in the moment.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like a big key for me is really like embracing seasons of life and just going with the flow of like, choosing to pursue this and not this necessarily right in this moment. Just because you're saying no now, no doesn't mean never. And I think that that's something that kind of gets me out of that productivity like mindset.
Mhm. Yeah. So let's share some tips. Let's share some
Yeah.
tips about what we've learned about this, about how you can really start to break free from this cult of efficiency when it comes to your creative projects and some of the things that we've learned that have been helpful for us.
Yeah. I think that these are some things that we've like really cultivated because both Sari and I, practice sewing as our job and as our hobby. So hopefully these tips will be useful to you too. So the number one tip that we have is realistic time management. So not only like having a schedule for yourself, which I'm a really big schedule person. I know not everyone is, but I think that our minds really benefit from the structure of a schedule. So it's not just having the schedule, it's about having it be realistic. And that means setting enough time aside for each part of your day. I know that, like, it's kind of like that whole thing where you're like, you're setting your alarm for the next morning. You're like, I can get ready in 15 minutes. No, you can't. You set the alarm 15 minutes earlier. You need more time. So be realistic with yourself. Set enough time aside for each part of your day, including your sewing. And for me personally, I always make sure that if I'm going to sit down to like work on a hobby, sewing in particular, that I like to have a minimum amount of time and really think about it for yourself. It's going to be different from person to person. What is the minimum amount of time that you can have to sew that you can settle into it? You can enjoy yourself. You're not going to feel rushed. I think, especially a couple years ago, I kept hearing this thing like in the sewing community of like, oh, just 20 minutes a day or 30 minutes a day. And I think if that works for you, that's awesome. You should do that. But for me, when I would try it, I would get like my heart would be racing. I'd feel like I was like, just like racing the clock. So for me, I really need to have at least an hour, preferably an hour and a half or more set aside for sewing for me to feel like I get enjoyment out of it. So manage your time, be realistic about the amount of time that you need, not just to accomplish what you want, but to like accomplish it with joy.
Yeah.
And then you're not like, like a hamster on a wheel.
Which is cute, but maybe not how you want to
It's,
feel.
yeah, yeah, totally. Definitely cute. Our second goal or second tip, I guess it could be a goal too, is to create boundaries around your time off. I know lots of people like us have been working from home, especially the last like year and a half with pandemic. And for me, this was like a big lesson because I'm one of those people who, if I don't remove myself physically from the space, it can be really hard to stop working. So create strong boundaries around what is your you time, what time is not for working. I think like thinking about your schedule in your life in a more like holistic way really helps you to like create that balance you need to give your hobbies the breathing room that they deserve.
Yeah, absolutely.
Uh,
Boundaries are huge, huge for me around time off. Like I've been working for myself for, I don't know, what is it, like 12 or 13 years now. And
mhm.
that has been something that has just been a lifesaver for me, is knowing that without boundaries, I will work myself into a tizzy. So I really need to have those really clear boundaries between when I'm working and when I'm not working.
Yeah, definitely. I try to like observe those same things in my home life too, where like, that's why my daughter has like a very strict bedtime because even with my child, I have boundaries. I'm like, no, no, time for you to go night night. Mommy's going to go
Yeah.
so now. Our third tip is to get clear on your goals and your why. I think that having like a really firm reason of why you are sewing or pursuing your hobby of choice is a much more compelling reason to set time aside for yourself rather than just like, I want to make this pair of jeans. That's like exciting and can be a fun short term. But if this is something that you want to be a long term, part of your life, then having those bigger whys and goals is really crucial for the longevity of your
Mhm.
hobby.
Yeah.
And then number four, our fourth tip is focusing on the experience and also the mental health benefits over the outcome. So I touched on this a little before. So not just like I want to make this pair of jeans, so I am setting aside X amount of time to sew. Is like why? How do you feel when you step away from your sewing machine? Do you feel better than when you started? Worse? I wager that you probably feel a little bit better, especially better than you did when you were mindlessly scrolling on Instagram or TikTok a few hours earlier. I know that I do. And having that kind of like, it can be really healthy for our mental and, you know, consequentially like physical health to have these kinds of productive hobbies incorporated into our rest time. It is very restful for your mind. And that leads us right into that flow state. The flow state is really creatively and mentally energizing. So, do the things that you think are going to help you achieve that flow state. For me personally, I like to like clean up my sewing space, put like some music on, a podcast. I have a TV in my sewing room. Sometimes I'll watch like a little TV and just set up that like nice environment for yourself where you're not going to want to leave, that you're going to like sit there and get really entranced in what you're doing. Because I don't know, for me, that like feels good. Like it's that like positive brain numbing, the kind I don't feel guilty about after I do it.
Yeah. Yeah, the kind that feels good.
Uh-huh, totally. Another big part of flow state is focusing on projects that like are just the right amount of challenge level. So it's not so easy that you can do it with your eyes closed, but not so challenging that you're thinking so hard that it stops you from getting into that like really chill mind space.
That's key for me, is having just
Mhm.
enough challenge to keep me engaged.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so just to recap the tips that Haley shared, and these are things that we have personally found. You may have found other things that help you to kind of get out of this efficiency and productivity mindset that we've been indoctrinated in. But the tips that we wanted to share with you are thinking realistically about the amount of time you want to set aside so you don't feel too rushed when you're doing your creative hobby. Setting boundaries
Mhm.
around your time off so you have a really clear boundary of what is your time to yourself that you can give to yourself. Getting clear on your goals and why you're doing what you're doing can be really, really helpful for this too. Focusing on the experience and the mental health benefits over the outcome, whatever you're making, will also help you to really slow down and relax into what you're doing. And then lastly, trying to achieve that flow state where you're doing something that's not too easy, not too challenging, where you feel really in the moment and really present with what you're doing. And I think that is something that we all strive to get out of any type of work that we're doing or any type of creative project. So think about that as a goal, maybe instead of actually just creating something new, the outcome that we were talking about. So those are our tips. That's what we've learned. If you have other things that help you to kind of get out of that mindset of efficiency and productivity above all else, let us know. We'd love to hear it. You could leave us a review and let us know, or you could post in the CMARC community. We'd love to start a discussion around this. So let us know. And if you want to learn more about this, we have some suggestions for you. We have an episode called What to Do When Your Hobby Feels Like a Chore. I think that's what it's called. So give that a listen. That also touches on these same themes. We also getting into that discussion of creating the space for your sewing. We have sewing spaces videos on YouTube where different members of our team show off their sewing spaces. And that can be really inspiring for kind of thinking about how you want to set up your creative space to induce that state of flow. We also have some articles in the magazine on this topic. So check out a magazine. And if you want to look for those, if you go to the category section, you can find those articles. And then the book that I mentioned is called Do Nothing by Celeste Headlee. I gave it like a 3 on Goodreads. I wrote a review of it on Goodreads. I I liked parts of it. I think the parts about the social history of overwork were pretty interesting to me. It gets a
Mhm.
little bit more into like some self-helpy stuff that I didn't find as useful for me personally. And I think there were some things that she missed. So I mentioned that I think people really enjoy work. And I think she doesn't really address that part in her books. I had a few disagreements with it, but I think it's a really interesting book nonetheless. Another book that if you're more interested in kind of the spiritual side of this, which I'm also very interested in, the more philosophical side of it maybe.
Mhm.
There's a book that I also recently read called A Life of Being, Having and Doing Enough by Wayne Muller. And he talks about the concept of enough and what is enough for you. So that's one that I would recommend. I think that was a really powerful book for me. There's also another book that, if you're interested in kind of the social history aspects, but you want more of kind of a fun and irreverent take on it, there's a book called How to Be Idle by Tom Hodgkinson, which I absolutely adore. And that's a little bit more of a humorous and irreverent sort of book about doing nothing and getting away from this cult of efficiency and overwork, which I read it several years ago, and I really should reread it because I thought it was a really both enlightening and really really fun. So that is kind of that's I gave you a lot of books to read, but I'm a big reader, as you guys can tell.
That's your homework.
Yeah, so that's your homework. I think that this idea, reading this book, Do Nothing, as I mentioned, there are some things that, I didn't necessarily agree with, but the one takeaway that I really got was this idea that there are these values ingrained in our culture because of business and, some of these influences of modern capitalism. And those things have become so much a part of our thinking and our frameworks for viewing our lives that they've almost become inescapable. And we are now thinking about efficiency. I think we humans have been obviously working very hard for a long time. The industrial revolution did not bring about the advent of hard work by any means, but
Yeah.
this idea of putting efficiency and productivity above everything else was really reinforced, I think, in our culture here in the US in the last, and in many other places in the world in the last century or so. So I think, thinking about how much that has influenced you and how inescapable that has been in all of our lives, and then what can we do to really break free of that in service of some of our other needs, some of our other natural inclinations and needs that have really been unaddressed because we're so focused on
Mhm.
efficiency and being productive and having more. And so that's why this concept of enough is very powerful, and thinking about what is enough for you, what is really going to be the most satisfying balance in your life. So I think just thinking about these things and exploring how these values have played out in your own life and the way that you look at your home life and your creative hobbies can be really edifying. And so I hope that we've given you some things to think about when it comes to your creative work. So if you liked this episode, if you have anything to share with us, please leave us a review. We would absolutely love to hear from you. We read all the reviews and we just love reading them. So if you have something that you liked about this episode, or if you want to share an idea for a future episode, or if you want us to expand on a topic, we would love to hear that. So be sure to leave us a review in whatever podcast platform that you use, whether that's Apple Podcasts, if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts right now, or Spotify, or any other podcast platform. So with that, we hope you have a great week.
See ya.
Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the team at Seamwork. Seamwork's an online community that supports you in creating a wardrobe that feels right for you. When you join us at Seamwork, you become part of our private community of makers, and you also get access to monthly sew-along classes, a library of over 200 sewing patterns, and tons of great resources to help guide you through the sewing adventure that you choose. Podcast listeners can get half off a Seamwork Unlimited membership, which means you can download as many of those 200 plus patterns as you want at any time, and our community will be there to guide and support you. If you'd like to join us for half off, just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find us on Instagram at Seamwork, or visit our YouTube channel, which is called Seamwork Video. We love hearing from you, so let us know if there's a topic or a personal story that you'd like us to cover. Thanks for listening to Seamwork Radio.